Hello all. This video is going to be on Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish. I also would like to weave in a lesser known essay called Governmentality, which I think is an interesting way to perhaps take the main concepts and approach of Discipline and Punish, because of course it's his most famous and well known work, and use that towards his lesser known essay on governmentality and see his actual politics and theory in a more concrete way. Of course, we started with the order of things in the last video, which is a rather abstract work, and now we're going to move into this what I call a second stage, really, for Foucault, where he's more focused on that Marxist classical, what's the praxis of actually seeing how power really disperses and decentralizes among a disciplinary society and its social control. There is a couple of insights, though, that I would like to point out with Foucault's analysis for power before we really get into Discipline and Punish. One is, of course, surveillance, which I think I want to put this in now, perhaps, to keep in mind throughout these videos on Foucault, with contemporary themes, with social media and observation and surveillance. And I think this is really paramount to get the most out of Foucault's work, because this is, of course, the culmination, really, of his methodology insofar that he wants us to understand power beyond just the classical you cross the sovereign, you get guillotine sort of way, or just the violence contextualization. No, there's actually a pernicious mechanisms of social control going on, and it starts really with surveillance and the power of observation. Second, of course, is to have normalization of behaviors, and of course the construction, really, of what normativity is for Foucault. And so this is, of course, going to be administered socially and instrumentally among in institutions within a society. And then the third is examination, which is, of course, this sort of affirmation towards the institutional practices or the capitalistic axioms, in that Deleuzian sense of what is considered a normal citizen in a society at any time, and the need for examination of corrective procedures among technicians. And so power is dispersed through institutions, whether formal or civil and non-governmental. This is, of course, like I said, I wanted to sprinkle in his insights of governmentality and kind of weave this into his analysis of punishment. And so for Foucault, of course, the body politic almost becomes quite literal, in a sense that the ebb and flows, what's allowed, what is allowed to be coded, what is disgraced or shamed, is really a political axiom, and what is normalized for the body, whether it's affirmed or denied different sensations, really acts as a sort of institutional segue. And this applies through as early as you enrolling in a preschool, and of course it goes to the correctional facilities for incorrective behavior states, such as the prison. There's also the modern hospital, which of course is an enclosure in and of itself, which actually somewhat appropriates the prison design and structure itself. You can notice that, especially in current times, where if you looked at the outside structure of a prison, a daycare, a hospital. Of course, other than the signs themselves, you might not actually be able to discern, what these different enclosures actually look like, in that architecture basis. And in a lot of ways, this is very important to consider when you're going through these different institutional segments or enclosures. But moving along, I wanted to put that in your head before we move on here. And so Foucault infamously, at least in my opinion, recounts the execution of Damien the Regicide in Paris in 1757. And it's absolutely brutal, of course. Damien is really just put through the ringer of deaths and shame on multiple levels, or picking apart his body, just doing every unfathomable act to the lived body, as it were, and to cause as much pain and suffering and shame as the public is able to watch this violent spectacle on our Damien character here. And despite this, though, we're going from 1757 outside the steps of Notre Dame to only a centennial time period later, really, of massive changes with not just public spectacle in the sphere of viewing such retribution, the shift towards the Enlightenment, if you will, or as he would call it, reformation of penology here. You go from Damien the execution in 1757 to its complete disappearance. There's no more accounts of something like Damien, at least done by the state, really. Just the few early decades of America, at least as a nation. And so just only in this span of a little under 100 years, you have this completely disappear from public consciousness and its actual acts within, or at least in a concrete way. And so Foucault, of course, is going to pick up on this and draw this out historically. And so the prisoners are subject, changing from crossing the big man sovereign, if you will, to now a rational system of reformation. And so instead of punishment in a sort of formalized authority, is redirected through education and workmen's programs. And for Foucault, this is a huge shift from body punishment, Damien's just being ripped apart, pain and shame is really the theme, onto the lived body, where Foucault is saying, in 100 years, you switch from, the body to now the soul. And the soul, of course, Foucault, didn't really believe in souls. He was an atheist. But the soul really is, behavior states, the way the criminal is psychologically put, if you will. And so really the goal then is one of re-education of normative behavior states. Foucault, of course, is massively influential in the anti-psychiatry movement, or just critiques against the sort of discipline and how it's administered by and large. And incidentally, of course, Foucault had many experiences with or personal experiences with such power structures. I believe as a child he was actually put through a sort of therapeutic process, and of course he probably thought very little of the encounter. And so, to reiterate, punishment, of course, is a political act, a configurement in society, and how the state administers it and there's a sort of doctrine or a sort of understanding, an episteme, if you will, as he would put it, and we have to actually see this morphology here to really understand power and punishment. And one of the insights, of course, that he wants to put for us is that the spectacle with punishment and crossing the sovereign in a transgression, had a particular crime in a particular person and place. And of course, this is going to then shift to the Enlightenment epoch, where punishment now is a private matter between the state and the subject. This is interesting to perhaps put in the Italian thinker Agamben, where he describes that bare naked life in contemporary times. And there's such whistleblowers in the last recent decades that certainly come to mind, where you're taken out of the society and put in this sort of relationship with the state that nobody else is able to actually access, nobody else is able to even see or recognize. It is simply you put into this bare naked world, away from the social. You're restricted from it, and as such the state can dispense with you in unusual ways. I think is what Foucault is really trying to direct us towards in this morphology here, from spitting on some criminal and throwing feces at it just a couple of centuries ago, to now criminals, you only can really see them on the television when they're being reprimanded, or social media clips of their last moments of freedom as they're leaving the courtroom. The courtroom, though, is somewhat still seeps through in this genealogy here, with it still being a sort of spectacle. There's these high case profiles, and that's kind of interesting to perhaps consider, where the courtroom actually is this spectacle aspect, even though the criminal isn't going to be bodily punished in front of us per se. But before I digress too far here, one of the other things to consider as well is that justice then, which was more in this sort of personalized sovereign way of crossing the sovereign's wishes, or his doctrine that he put out for his kingdom, or feudalism, if you will. This sort of justice then is severed towards a more abstract understanding and administration of punishment. After all, the prison system, at least in Foucault's time, is ultimately upheld by the French Interior Ministry, but the actual punishments are of the French Navy capacity, and their responsibility of administering work groups. And this, of course, is fundamental toward the disappearance, really, of the spectacle. And again, this just shows that, as we're moving along here, seeing these shifts in punishment, we're also seeing the growing of this institutional network where there is, multiple disciplines that are being used. There's multiple judges now. There's multiple executioners, or just because they're not standing next to a guillotine doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have control over our bodies or our souls even. And so the body is an intermediary in a sense for a penality of constrictions and privations, obligations, or prohibitions, as I've alluded to before. But power, of course, is more than just this, bodily violence, but the exercise of these, prior understandings of punishment onto the body, more than just this, physical pain, or the classic eye for an eye, if you will. And the decline of the spectacle and the executioner really, as they fade away into, the past with a past episteme, you have the resurrection of new institutions and ways of authority and control, or at least the administrators of these mechanisms, with the likes of the technician, with the warder who oversees the clinician and the doctor, and of course the psychologist. One of his more concrete examples he points to in his historicism is, of course, with the guillotine. The guillotine is introduced as really an equal death in the Enlightenment epoch. It's an act all, single, one use death per human, if you will, in that sort of humanism sense that we're starting to see rise up here. And so you're seeing then that you have, an equal death, the equal means to administer it, and the guillotine, of course, by 1793, of course, is minimizing shame and actually, goes from the public square to then a private matter. And this is, of course, again, showing how just because, there's these small tweaks in how we understand the concept of punishment, these are actually really important differences in understanding his method here towards something like punishment. Again, I think one of the good things about Foucault is when he is using this method towards something like the guillotine or something. There's a rich trove, I think, of understanding with tracing the guillotine here from the public square before becoming a private matter, and then becoming eradicated, and the spectacle of seeing in the public, and the function of power then shifts as this also changes towards a more decentralized way of judging what is an equal death for all. Then this then ties into what's called penal sobriety, and it's sober to its punishment and use of torture, which really takes off in the 19th century. And so the body in penal sobriety goes, of course, from the act of being tortured in the painful bodily experience to then one of discipline as the function of power. And so this ties into how this plays into something like a college university, a prison, the factory enclosure. You have to have all of these different disciplines and institutions then in the penal sobriety state, and how we evaluate and measure really the changes of the soul to the correction. And so the shift to the discipline of the soul is, of course, done by being able to observe and supervise a criminal and to neutralize the mind states towards one that's not altering the, making the criminal, if you will, dangerous. But of course, if there even is any changes in the soul, this observational process, this subjugating yourself to these normalizations that these institutions or judges or power figures, if you will, have decided at any time to evaluate you for, whether or not they're being affirmed or administered properly. And again, this goes back to going from that violent bodily, really one act, and even with the guillotine, the one size fits all, to now judgments of the soul and its changes. But yet still, despite, if you you perhaps could be rewarded for good behavior, but you still have this perpetual evaluation. You're never really over the crime, as it. But to really perhaps clean up this discussion here, if we were going to look back at 1757 with the epistemological sort of requirements, if you will, punishment simply required knowledge about an offense, the knowledge of the offender or criminal, and the knowledge of the sovereign's wishes, or in this case laws. And so whereas today you're seeing the punishment in modernity has far more comprehensive judgments and assessments and ultimately diagnosis among technicians. Certainly this is the case with the introduction of insanity and delusion as the sort of behavior mind state that could be attributed to a criminal, insofar as saying that this is actually not really a crime, even though something tragic could have happened. In other words, punishment requires knowledge now of multiple domains and requires multiple evaluations across disciplines and technicians. And so a judge, in that sense, requires the evaluation of an epistemic truth in these types of knowledge, which requires it to be legitimized, if you will. And so this kind of ties into his understanding of madness here, where practical punishment in 1810, madness isn't considered this evaluation really of the criminal. It's just simply knowledge of the law. Was the line crossed here, and what should the punishment be? But of course, by 1832, and the rise, and certainly in the history of ideas here, you're seeing this happen. It coincides really with such movements of really psychology becoming, and the social becoming more of an evaluated discipline towards how power and statecraft really, in some senses, actually done. Of course, for someone like Husserl in the philosophical sense, he was of course afraid of, or feared, if you will, that behavior states then, if there's no mature theoretical proofs, then the evaluation then of behavior states has to be paramount, because psychology then really becomes the dominant discipline with regards to perspective. And if someone has an impaired perspective, such as someone who's mad, then was there really a criminal act done? And of course, as we've done on the channel, we've traced that sort of ethical thinking throughout certainly the Anglosphere. And that's just an aside here to perhaps bring up when Foucault starts talking about this concept of madness, and how madness as a concept or a construction didn't exist in the Renaissance, but comes into being in the epoch of the Enlightenment with reason. And so crime itself becomes an aspect of insanity. In Foucault's own words, today the judge does more than judging, and so the judge then must know about these technical truths and evaluations of behavior states, such as psychology, as I mentioned. And so the judge's power in his decision-making is decentralized through the psychologist and the evaluation of the criminal under surveillance for normative affirmations to, of course, attribute to something like good behavior or reduced sentencing, whatever the case may be. And so this reassessment through wardens and councils to ultimately evaluate and observe the prisoner over that said sentence. And so despite our understanding of power, usually in a rudimentary, which for many people doesn't really feign too far from something like 1757, the judge and the technician now is much more elaborate in this constant, networking of institutions and power that has, fallen to the wayside as compared to that primitive mode before. And so Foucault's direction and analysis then of punishments are, mechanisms that elaborate in this, interwoven network of techniques and disciplines. Punishment, of course, is the political directive, and science then, of course, plays a role into how those laws are related with, of course, the like of psychology. And so, as mentioned before, then the body is vested in with those, relationships. Your relationship with the episteme of knowledge or science, and how it creates laws, and as such, the same with how punishment is going to be evaluated as a sort of political access here. Again, a more concrete way of looking at this, we could look at the subjugation of the name tag, the naming of a body in an institutional enclosure. Of course, this isn't an act of violence, but one of calculation and organization. Again, going back to that soft, power of observation over another. And so power then, in this morphology here, cannot just be a particular place and institution as it used to be, but something like Congress or the presidency or the three branches of government, if you will. This everyday use of power then goes to the wayside because it isn't in this uniformed fashion anymore. It's now decentralized, and so you can't really ever just point at one single institution in this network and say this is the culprit, this is the problem here. It's very rhizomatic. But to continue with Foucault here, it's important to understand the power and knowledge relationship. Power is he who knows, rather than a person just subjugated to power. An analysis really of not just who is being controlled, but one of who knows, or one who has power. And as such, the technicians decide how power is to be used, because they are he who knows. And so Foucault's saying that this is a different way of looking with his method here of a concept of power, and says it's far more dynamic to perhaps look at he who knows rather than just has control over an arbitrary situation, if you will. And so past ways of power analysis fails to account for looking at knowledge in this way, and its changes in static framework like violence or idealized metaphors of property or social contract theory. In that sense, Foucault becomes far more dynamic in being able to actually perhaps use his insights in a different epoch, if you will, or a different framework of understanding power. It's not just constricted to just a single one episteme. So for Foucault, history of punishment then is a history of present day power systems. And I think that's a good way to segue to his governmentality essay now. His essay is really a historicism of Machiavellian advice to the sovereign, or at least he traces this back to the Renaissance, really, or Prince, to a sort of binary of the art of government with the likes of Thomas Hobbes and the Leviathan. And so as he goes along, he's going to also bring up the likes of Rousseau and social contract theory. So to begin with the 1600s, then you can see a shift from advice to the king as Machiavelli to then an art of government as a distinction worth really noting as you go from the advice to the sovereign to a sort of artistic government or government mentality that our present day, or at least the Enlightenment, saw itself in. And this lineage and shift is rather important to Foucault. And so government treaties with the self is really one of Stoicism, or the soul in the pastoral sense, and the governing of education or the governing of government, such as constitutions really are the relations of elite practices or a social contract. One way of looking at the U.S. Constitution, of course, is really seeing how it's really almost a sort of rule book, if you will, written on how institutions are supposed to carry themselves and how they can balance and check themselves in their relations. It has very little actually to do with something like the ethics of how someone in Chicago or New York City are. It's definitely not a sort of Plato's republic of how man should be and how that coincides and goes into the macrocosm of a greater republic. This is just simply about these power fixtures that they really invoked historically, and seeing past republics such as, of course, the Roman Empire, and trying to create a sort of neutral way of confiding them to this constitutional social contract, an art of government, as it were. And so, again, those government treaties, the advice really is one of the self and the soul, to then an actually artistic way of looking at it across complex social institutions. The 1600s as a process of really taking those feudal, tribal, decentralized kingdoms really and centralizing them into the modern statecraft concept, the modern nation state. And so the government should act in the best interest of the soul, just as the pastor did in that religious element to invoke. And so you have an assemblage really of centrality in the rules and methods of the soul. So Machiavelli for Foucault is the standard bearer to understanding government initially, and it's regarded as high praise as it was introduced across the Renaissances. Then it falters. It's actually interesting to see how especially these older texts, they falter to the wayside in certain epochs, and then they are resurrected again. And Machiavelli makes a return in the 19th century, and I think to some extent, certainly in a lot of dissident circles now, you see him reemerging again, and his advice really, and his understanding of this initial for Foucault, this just this one way of how the government mentality actually operates is what he's really going to say is the error here. One of the insights, of course, is, or at least key questions, in advice to the prince, or at least in this time period for Machiavelli, is how and what conditions of the rules of the sovereign or state and how it's maintained, for the ruler. And so the prince really is articulating the rational play into an art of government. For the prince is transcendent over his principality. The prince, of course, doesn't have to be ethical if it means him reaffirming his power and maintaining rule. The prince is above the principality, and this play here goes, towards, again, that art of governing. So the prince is transcendent in the maintenance or being superior, but this is, of course, only one distinction. And so we have a multitude of relations of the government to the people. And so mainly plurals are necessary for the relationship of the type of relations of the people to the government. And so the prince then is just the first relationship of that art of government. And this continues really as a theme through all of these types of governments. There's really two articulations of how this works with, you're upward of a person's ability to be the sort of stoic self-government, and ascends onto the state. In other words, the government are for and directed by the people. Whereas you have the alternative, which is downward, which is the movement of government and laws and taxes to be enforced onto the people. Again, he's building in this essay that sort of difference between the self and the art of government, and how we'll end up seeing the state and the sovereign. And so these forces assemble in the likes of an economy of the forms of material exchange and material wealth is made in a society. And so government then has to focus on its economic productivity, for it will lose capacity as it assembles. And so, again, he's saying, there's more than one, form of power than just being able to enact violence or being able to, have control of something like, military manpower. Something such as taxation, of course, requires the state to be able to use taxes as a sort of mechanism of trying to control economic output and situations. And so the introducing of the economy enforces that art of government, as government requires means to the inhabitants as a form of control and surveillance. I think we could say perhaps in the last decade or so with crypto, and its use of surveillance as it morphed into this from the vestiges of the dark web to the public square that's now advertised on every TV station. Every time something new or something, and almost in that Deleuzian sense again, to bring him in to compare to Foucault here, which will of course end up being coded onto and used by the state and its mechanisms of control. But to put it before moving along to put a bow on this is, government really is the order of things, or at least its corrective capacity in the ordering of things. And so things itself shifts in the Machiavellian. Things is, a kingdom's territory or a principality, and, the inhabitants within it. Things are the relationship of man to particulars, such as gold, climate, resources, and relations of men to custom or culture or even thinking. And then, of course, you have the relationship between man and, something like a natural tragedy, or, ruling with nature and contenting with it, and that relationship capacity. And so you can see with the metaphor really of, what citizenship is. It's the ship slash, citizen. Citizenship, has different positions and roles, of course, among sailors. And so this goes into the sort of etymology of, the inhabitant as citizens. So the citizen in that assemblage then is, the citizen plus ship. being as a sailor has, statuses, duties, and responsibilities. And the complexity of man and things and the proprietarian view is only one relation of governmentality between man and things. Again, he's saying that these past ways of understanding government is reductionary, or at least in the social contract sense of property. And so we see again this government versus sovereignty government is of status where sovereignty is really one more in the downward trajectory of adherence to laws and taxation or ordering. Government is the role of the status of things, and must act in an economic capacity to the best interest of a society. And sovereignty uses law as the instrument, whereas government has multi-dimensional way of using taxation or subsidies for determined, or at least trying to prohibit or allow certain leanings for economic output. Of course, there's taxation, but think of something like subsidies, where it used to be one of getting rid of excess. Now we use subsidies to try to ramp up research and development and productivity. And so, as we're seeing here, the bureaucracy or technicians functions as government outside of the domain of just the sovereignty and its law creation capacity. The systems are the art of government as opposed to sovereignty. The sovereign is one of the classical concept of something like a Congress. The government is one of the discipline, the technocrat, and so the art of government subtly grew in this in an expansive period. Foucault insists, of course, that this happens during in expansive eras where you have economic tension and certainly in the 17th century, military politics. The 17th century wasn't, really a time of prosperity, if you will, of expansion, where as you go along to the 18th, you can immerse yourself with this sort of subtle growth, and so the colonial expansion, such as England and France, done for the purpose of economics, develops this mentality of governmentality. And so there's three thresholds for Foucault's classification. Mercantilism, or moments really that move governmentality. And so mercantilism is non-sovereign acts developed. The second threshold is population increasing. So the government is seen as a sort of model of this family relationship or the political father. So again, as you're expanding out to how the father wasn't just a household figure, but actually played a role in the politics of a tribe or a city-state. And as the population increases, that model really expands, or at least grows in that subtle capacity, beyond just the family relationships. And the third threshold is the economy really becoming its own social sphere, or an actual reality in and of itself, where it's ad nauseum, really just circularizes its own justification because it's its own reality now. And so these are the stages along the development or expansion of governmentality. And so Foucault acknowledges the shift from an embodied or state of justice to the administrative state, or colonial expansion to the state of government in the modern world. And so all sectors of society are really organized for the economic benefit of what government designates as its populational interest. And so Foucault says that discussing politics requires an analysis of power, which is more than just social contract constitutionalism. Foucault, through of course his Marxist background, says that the economic activity requires an analysis of really the state's ambition as government in that Marxian, or at least for Marx, played an active role, of course, in economic activity. And so Foucault, again, is showing us this decentralized view of power and its roles within how a government actually expands. And so if we ask of a government being righteous or good, then we must ask what government actually consistently is. And Foucault, at least in his arguments here, is saying, in the past we had, proprietarianism, these social contracts. This is just the law way of power. There's a far more dynamic version of power embedded. And so understanding these historical notions of sovereignty and its instrumental creation of laws and its enforcing is his more dynamic version of this that perhaps can lend us to how we'll see future transformations of power. So this is going to really put a bow on this video of Discipline and Punish, or at least the main ideas and thesis, if you will, through, again, what I would consider his second project, which is putting a sort of concretization really of what it means to have knowledge and power in its relationship to the greater society and how it administers punishment, and how that will influence our ethics and lives, which is a segue, of course, to his ending works, which we'll get into in the next video, with the history of sexuality, which I think is appropriate to really end on, which is his last, I think, work, actually chronologically anyway, or his last works, and seeing him, shift towards his ethics and, what all of, the prior works lead into towards his freedom, or at least what he considers human freedom, and his view of nature and its construction. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this video on Discipline and Punish, and also his essay on Governmentality. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you for the next one.